Welcome to Oxford Analytica's weekly look at key trends in the global political economy. I'm Tom Wales, Director of Analysis, and I'm joined once again by Joe Ford, OA's head of our Africa desk. I'm here to discuss the Africa growth story in general and sound a couple of cautionary notes for some of our clients, perhaps, on issues that aren't really widely understood and certainly aren't often discussed, even in major international business outlets. And one of those is the reliability of data in general when it comes to African economies, and what that may mean in terms of the challenges that we and others encounter when we try to analyze these economies, and in particular whether or not they've made a successful transition to a kind of developing economy stage from frontier economies in many of these cases. So Joe, what are some concerns that our clients should be aware of on this issue?
Well, Tom, you've to some extent hit the nail on the head in that probably the single biggest challenge we face as analysts of the sort of Africa Rising story is giving some measurable sense to that story. So our conference, upcoming September conference, Africa panel, is entitled Measuring Success, precisely because there is so much uncertainty, mythology, etc., around data sets, around definitions of things like the middle class and so on. And we thought it a very good time to stand back and think about what do we actually know about the region and its various economies. There's definitely something going on in a growth sense, but what is the quality of that growth? To what extent is it tied to familiar patterns of commodity exports and raw commodity exports? To what extent is there diversification in some of the oil exporting countries, for example? And what can we really know, and how reliable are the sources of information that we have? This is a very big issue for clients, a very big issue for analysts of the Africa story.
So let's zero in on this problem in one or two areas. We ran an analysis on Monday which talked about some of the problems associated with measuring educational availability and outcomes in African countries. This is, for obvious reasons, of high significance, because if you're going to make the transition to a developing economy on a kind of high-quality growth track, you're going to need an increasingly educated workforce, particularly given global competition. But what do we know about the education story in Africa? Is it as good as some external reviewers have made it sound?
Well, on one level, I mean, you talked about availability, and in the sort of framework of the Millennium Development Goals and the effort that's been put in by African governments themselves, by donors, into increasing access to education, especially primary education, so the goal of universal primary education, there has been a lot of progress in the last decade. I guess, and what part of the issue, I suppose, around that is there's still some measurement questions around merely that success story of greater availability, especially for girls relative to boys in access to primary education. But we still, from what we know, have about 24% of African children who never go to primary school, another 24% who don't complete, and another 25% who complete but don't go on to secondary education. And that, as you say, ties into, even before one gets to the quality question, quality of outcomes, quality of education, ties into all the narratives that we see around Africa in terms of creating, you can think of them in C's, better citizens, more aware, better educated citizens, better colleagues or employed colleagues, so skills and the creation of a skill set in Africa that could possibly match Asia's, for example. And you can think of it in terms of consumers, of course, so both because people are employed and therefore able to contribute as consumers to this demand idea in Africa. And that all begins with another C, which is classmates. So it's about how how to get more children into school and to achieve education outcomes which are capable of giving the current sort of last decade of African growth a far more sustainable trajectory. And really what we see, again, subject to all the problems of measuring it, really what we see are, we think, a number of reasons to question whether those education outcomes, despite the money being thrown at the issue, really position Africa to sustain that growth, to sustain the sorts of sort of class formation and skills-based formation that would position it to compete and to sort of follow, as is often thought, the inevitable trajectory of some of the Asian economies. So availability, we've had some considerable success stories, but outcomes, again, there's a great debate to be had on how we measure outcomes in primary, secondary and tertiary education levels in Africa. South Africa spends 6% of GDP equivalent, 21% of government expenditure on education. Culturally, it's a very big demand for quality education. There's a very big cultural value attached to that. But for example, in South Africa's case, the amount spent on education, public education, as far as we can tell, hasn't translated into greater skill sets, greater capabilities in school leavers.
Well, thanks very much, Joe. These struck me, and I hope will strike our viewers, as a number of very valuable cautionary points when it comes to African growth and sustainability after a decade in which the continent has benefited from, as you say, some very high commodity prices. This will, as are many other global trends that we follow in these weekly broadcasts, be a major topic of conversation at our annual conference in September. We hope that you can join us then. For Joe and the rest of us at OA, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to discussing a couple other related issues next week.